So I want to begin this lecture by talking about Reconstruction. And I want to focus, for the bulk of the lecture, on two individuals. Two men who would eventually become senators from the state of Mississippi. Blanche K. Bruce and Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels was the first ever Black American to serve in either House of Congress as a senator from the state of Mississippi, and Blanche K. Bruce was the first Black American to serve a full term as a senator in the United States Senate. Both of these individuals played a pivotal role in the political development of the United States government in the 1870s and 1880s. These individuals were not just important as great firsts, as the first Black Americans to serve in the United States Senate. They were important in terms of their accomplishments, what they did, what they achieved, and how they changed the political landscape. These two individuals not only helped shape policy towards Reconstruction and the development of the Deep South, they also opened up access to kind of higher society to Black Americans that had previously been denied them. So they were very influential in promoting Black Americans throughout the government. So let's begin with just a little bit of background information about Reconstruction. What Reconstruction was, why it was necessary, and what the federal government hoped to achieve. During the American Civil War, the Confederate States that had split from the Union had been involved in a total war, a very destructive armed contest with the United States military. At the very beginning of Reconstruction, the leadership of the United States government was the same as it had been during the prosecution of the war. Abraham Lincoln was president, Andrew Johnson was vice president. And Lincoln and Johnson wanted to prevent lasting animosity. The Civil War was extraordinarily horrible. Around 1 million Americans had been killed during the fighting. The war had been fought throughout the length and breadth of the South, and much of the southern states, their economies and their agricultural systems were completely destroyed. Not to mention the fact that the mainstay of the southern economy, which was slavery, was ended as a result of the war, the Union victory in the war. The Union Army and the Confederate Army, for that matter, had both made tremendous technological advances during the prosecution of the war. For example, I have a picture here of a Gatling gun, the first type of machine gun that was used in warfare. And this was first used by the Union Army at a battle called the Siege of Petersburg in the Eastern Theater of the Civil War. So this was very, very, very destructive. And Lincoln and Johnson wanted to make sure that the southern states didn't try again, that they they wanted to prevent any bitterness developing culturally. So they came up with what they called the 10% plan. If only 10% of the inhabitants, the voting base of the former Confederate states, would swear allegiance to the Union, that state would be readmitted into the Union as if it had never left, with its 2 senators and its representatives according to the population. There would be no punishment for the rebels. There would be no political trials. It was a very, 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 very generous deal. And Lincoln was popular enough that he had the political clout to push this deal, which would have led to a very speedy Reconstruction. At least it was believed at the time. Unfortunately for most of the former Confederates, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. When he was assassinated, his vice president, Andrew Johnson, succeeded him as president. But Johnson didn't have the same political clout that Lincoln had when it came to reconstructing the southern states. Johnson wanted to continue Lincoln's plan of being relatively lenient with the southern states. The problem was he didn't have enough political power to keep the radical Republicans in control. At that point, the Republican Party was split between moderates, like Lincoln and Johnson, and radicals. And the radical Republicans, like Charles Sumner, wanted to punish the South. It had been a horrific struggle, fighting the prosecution of the war, and they wanted to both punish the rebels for treason, and they wanted to ensure that the formerly enslaved population, that they were politically enfranchised to the utmost degree possible. And so this created an infighting between Republicans at the time. I'll take a quick moment to talk about the three amendments that would play a pivotal role in shaping Reconstruction. These are constitutional amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. It's important to know these, to know which is which. And so if somebody brings up the 14th Amendment, you know exactly what is being referred to, because it's very relevant politically. These are relevant politically today. The 13th Amendment essentially outlaws slavery. The system of chattel slavery that had been prominent throughout the southern states since the inception of the United States was now completely abolished, with one exception. If you notice when you look in the language, it says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment for crime, right? So if you are convicted of a crime, technically you can become the slave of the state. The state can make you work without pay against your will, which is the definition of slavery. And that's, when I learned that, I thought that was very, 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 very strange. But it's true. It's true. Nonetheless, as an institution throughout society, slavery was abolished. There had always been free black Americans since the beginning of the establishment of the United States. It is erroneous to assume that every black American prior to the end of the Civil War was enslaved. That was not the case. Nevertheless, these free black Americans kind of occupied an ambiguous place politically. Were they true citizens? Were they true Americans? The next amendment, the 14th Amendment, would decide that in the affirmative. So essentially, all of these freed slaves would be considered full U.S. citizens, just as American as every other individual born inside the United States. And this was an amendment championed by Frederick Douglass. And the idea was that it would put to rest this question as to whether or not freed black Americans belonged in the United States. And this was something that was being debated by many leaders in the Union, even before the end of the Civil War, with Abraham Lincoln wrestling with this issue himself. The final amendment, the 15th Amendment, established that the right to vote could not be deprived of any citizen, regardless of their race. And of course, this was all about the potential political power of those who had formerly been enslaved. Right? So you had millions of people who were now citizens, and this answered in the affirmative the question of whether or not they would be able to fully participate in political life. And so this amendment guaranteed the right to vote. And this was important because this was something that in the former Confederate states, people were literally dying over. There was a great amount of conflict over this issue. In fact, this issue of former slaves voting was the animating concern of the Ku Klux Klan, which had been founded in Pulaski, Tennessee by a former Confederate general named Nathan Bedford Forrest. The idea was that by using terrorist tactics, attacking polling workers, attacking Black Americans who were trying to vote or to register people to vote, or who were engaging in kind of political campaigning, that by engaging in terrorist attacks, and including attacks on Union soldiers, that they could force their will on this issue, that they could prevent the Black population from becoming politically enfranchised. And of course, this would produce a response from the federal government when the President Ulysses S. Grant would sign the Ku Klux Klan Act and authorize federal troops to pursue and prosecute Klansmen as they attempted to deny Black Americans their right to the franchise. With federal troops present in the South, guarding polling stations, protecting the rights of formerly enslaved Americans to vote, you see a surge in political power of the Black population. With so many former Confederates disenfranchised for having participated in the rebellion, this accentuated the political power of these groups, and those whites who were from the South yet who served in the Union Army or supported the Union, they were called scalawags by the majority. There were a considerable number of them in different parts of the South, particularly in the Appalachian parts of the South. Those pro-Union whites and former slaves had the bulk of the political power. And so you have Republican domination of the southern states for the period of Reconstruction. With President Grant using federal troops to protect the voting rights of Black Americans, Black American political power began to assert itself. First of all, Grant was the first to appoint a Black American to a federal post as part of his administration, and this was significant. In turn, you start to see throughout the former Confederate states, particularly where the Black population had very, very large numbers, you start to see Black political figures being elected to high office. And the first of these was Hiram Revels. Hiram Revels was an exceptional person, not just for his role in expanding political participation to the formerly enslaved population, but because of his own personal qualities. He came from a free background. Again, not every Black American in 1860, at the onset, in 1861, at the onset of the Civil War, was enslaved. There was a large population of freed Black Americans in many states, and he came out of that, out of one of those communities, and he was the first Black member of the Senate. He was an ordained minister. He had began his ministry in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and he was known as an extraordinarily eloquent speaker. And this is what propelled his political career forward. One of the reasons that Revels rose so rapidly from first a minister in Natchez, Mississippi, to a state senator, to a United States senator, was due to the prayer he gave at the opening of the Mississippi Senate in 1870. This prayer was considered extraordinarily eloquent, very moving for all those involved, and it skyrocketed his popularity. And this is another example of his eloquence as a speaker. When Revels attempted to take his place in the Senate, he was actually prevented from doing so. Many in the Democratic Party had opposed his entry into the Senate based on what was called the Dred Scott decision, which was an earlier Supreme Court case that argued that the Supreme Court had stated that Black Americans were not citizens and weren't entitled to the same protections as citizens. And of course, this is after the 14th Amendment. And so those who, particularly the Republicans at the time, argued in favor of including Revels, based on arguing that the post-Civil War amendments had superseded the Dred Scott decision. And ultimately, Revels took his seat. But it's an example of just how harsh a fight that an individual like Revels had to engage in. The fact that he was so eloquent and so almost universally well-liked, but still had to face tremendous barriers even after being elected as a senator. Once he was in the Senate, Revels actually was a compromiser. He was very moderate as a Republican. He believed that the former Confederates should be granted a general amnesty, provided that they swore an oath of loyalty to the Union. So he believed in forgiveness for the former Confederate officers and soldiers who had engaged in the rebellion. And this separated him from the more radical Republicans who desired to punish the former Confederates. Revels believed that once the immediate aftermath of the war had subsided, that all of the populations of the southern states would be able to rebuild and eventually create an environment of equality and harmony. He personally made many inroads in the integration of Black Americans into the political class and into political power. For example, he endorsed the first African American appointee to the United States Military Academy at West Point. He argued for the integration of Washington, D.C. schools. And of course, this is in the early 1870s. This is very far back for that kind of activism. And lastly, he advocated for the right of Black workers to work at the Washington Naval Yards. And this was a very lucrative field of construction of shipping for the U.S. Navy. And he believed that it should be open to all Americans. And he was successful in actually getting that integrated. After his term in the Senate, Revels became the president of Alcorn State University in Mississippi, which was an historically Black college, one of the first in the country. And he maintained his role as a minister, and towards the end of his life, he became more and more concerned with theological and spiritual writings and interpretations of Scripture. His faith animated him throughout his life, and as he ended his life, it became the dominant force in his life. Next, we'll take a look at another famous Black senator, Blanche K. Bruce. Bruce, like Revels, also served as a senator from Mississippi. However, he had not been born to free parents. In fact, he was born a slave. Bruce was born on a plantation in Virginia. It was believed that his father was the owner of the plantation. Bruce eventually escaped that plantation and attended Oberlin College, which is in itself an exceptional feat considering where he began in life. The fact that Bruce was born into actual slavery and died at the height of Washingtonian high society is extraordinarily impressive. And this characterizes much of the achievements of Black American political figures at the time. Between 1865 and 1965, the Black American population made economic and political gains that we have rarely seen historically. At least to my knowledge, only Japan made the level of progress that we see in Black America during that 100-year period. A level of progress comparable to that of Black America during that 100-year period. Blanche eventually traveled to Mississippi and bought a large plantation. And once he was a very large landowner there, he began to run for political office, first being elected sheriff of Bolivar County. In 1870, he was elected to the Mississippi State Senate. And then in 1874, he was elected to the United States Senate. And just like rebels before him, when he entered service in the United States Senate, he was considered a moderate who supported the reconciliation between the former Confederates and the rest of the nation. After his term in the Senate was over, he was appointed as Register of the U.S. Treasury. And this was a very important position because this was the individual who managed the federal government's debts. Right? So he was the one responsible for keeping the government's accounts, and it was his signature that was on every piece of currency printed during his time in office. In fact, he did such an exemplary job that it became a matter of custom after his time in office to appoint a Black Republican political figure as register of the Treasury during every subsequent Republican administration. There were 4 Black registers of the Treasury who served directly in a row. That was only ended when President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, appointed a white register out of outcry from those of his party. It's necessary now to take a look at the end of Reconstruction and why the Southern Democrats were able to retake power and end the period of rule by men like Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce. It begins with the General Amnesty Act of 1872, which allowed former Confederates to hold office. This meant that very, very popular former Confederate officers could now run for office, and this secured many of the offices in southern states for former Confederates. Grant was elected in 1868 and again in 1872, but his administration struggled in some areas. The Grant administration had enjoyed great success in using federal troops to protect the voting rights of Black American voters in southern states. Unfortunately for the administration, the Grant administration also developed a reputation for corruption. That political favors were handed out, that there was a lot of wheeling and dealing, and this is one of the reasons that this time period is called the Gilded Age, right? A kind of golden age of corruption. Grant lost a great deal of the popularity that the Republicans had held during his 2 elections. So by 1876, the Democrats had much greater chance of the presidency than they had had in 1872. The Democrats were running the governor of New York, Samuel Tilden, in 1876, and he very, very narrowly missed winning the presidency in 1876. When the final was tallied, Tilden and Hayes, neither of them enjoyed a clear majority of the Electoral College. So there was a dispute as to who would win the presidency. Would it be the Democrat, Tilden, or the Republican, Hayes? Well, this resulted in the Compromise of 1877, in which the Republican candidate, Hayes, allegedly agreed to withdraw all federal troops from southern states in exchange for the delegates in the contentious states supporting him for president and ending the crisis. Neither candidate had a majority. After the compromise, Hayes had a majority and took office, and immediately withdrew the last federal troops from the South. With the federal troops out of the South, groups like the Ku Klux Klan began to reassert themselves and began to strip away the voting rights of most of the black population. So by 1905, most black Americans in these southern states were, for the most part, completely disenfranchised. And we start to see the so-called black codes or Jim Crow laws being passed. Okay, so we'll talk more about that in our next lecture.